to be at a higher tier of this stuff, it takes a lot of balls. I mean, these guys that have God knows how much money into an engine and are willing to say, you know what, I'm going to put 80 pounds of boost in that, and I'm going to turn on 2 kits of nitrous, and I don't give a fuck if it blows up. And by the way, I'm going to strap myself into this thing.
Welcome to the HPA Tuned In podcast. I'm Andre, your host, and in this episode, we're interviewing Cody Phillips from Cody Phillips Racing. Now, Cody is a very well-known fixture in the drag racing scene, particularly with his 2JZ powered JZA80 Supra. This is one of the fastest IRS or independent rear suspension Supras in the world, running as quick as 681 at well over 200 mile an hour. Now, yes, I know there are Supras and 2JZs deep into the fives at this point. So on face value, that doesn't sound that impressive, but this is an independent rear suspension vehicle, stock rear suspension, which puts him at a significant disadvantage. It is also a essentially full weight car with full glass throughout and weighs somewhere in the region of 3,000 plus pounds. So it is no lightweight, and make no mistake, he is at the cutting edge. Cody is also well known for his professional motorsport wiring harnesses, which is part of his Cody Phillips Racing business. We've interviewed him before on our YouTube channel more about the wiring. Today we dive really deep into his Supra and learn some of the inside secrets that you just won't hear about. I'm talking here about head gasket sealing. I'm talking about turbo boost control strategies, launch control strategies, billet blocks versus cast blocks, the journey that he is still going down with the development of a brand new billet cylinder head for the 2JZ, CO2 boost control, the list goes on. So for anyone with an interest in drag racing, this interview is gold. Before we get into that interview though, for those who maybe haven't heard of High Performance Academy before or who are new to this podcast, HPA is an online training school. We specialize in teaching people how to tune EFI, how to build performance engines, construct wiring harnesses. We cover race driver education, race car setup and optimization, as well as data analysis techniques. Now, we cover a wide range of topics today in our chat with Cody, but really we are talking predominantly around tuning aspects. So relevant to our topic today, of course, are our tuning courses. This would start with our EFI Tuning Fundamentals course, and also for those who want to learn the practical elements of that, our practical standalone tuning course is a great addition. And I know particularly for those who are fresh to EFI tuning, when it comes to installing and tuning your first ECU, particularly if you have no start file or base map, it can be really daunting. What do you do first, and what order should you progress in? What we've done within our practical standalone tuning course is broken the entire tuning process down into the HPA 10-step process. By doing this, each of those individual steps is relatively quick and easy to complete. In no time, you've got to the end, you've got a completely tuned engine delivering great power, great torque, and most importantly, great reliability. Important to mention that these courses are applicable irrespective what brand of ECU you're personally interested in tuning, and it also doesn't matter what engine you want to tune. These courses will be perfect for you. Now, you can use the coupon code podcast75. That's going to get you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course. We'll put a link in the description to those courses. All right, with that introduction out of the way, let's get into our chat now. All right, welcome to the podcast, Cody. Thanks for joining us today. You're really well known for your amazing, immaculate Supra drag car. And I'm interested to start with, just to get a little insight into what got you personally interested in drag racing as a form of motorsport.
Well, I think if people ask me this question, I tell them what got me into cars is RC cars. So as a youngster, I sort of fell in love with just driving RC cars around the neighborhood, and back then you had to put them all together. I just got a new one for my son for Christmas, and the thing comes fully assembled now. So,
it's missing half the fun.
Yeah, so it was that whole experience of learning what a differential does and is from the inside out, not watching a video or something, and you're just looking at some instruction manual in the mid 90s. So kind of all stems from there, and really just had fun when I was a young teen, starting to race at local tracks, and just kind of always had that bug, I guess you could say. I kind of grew up in the sand dunes and riding three-wheelers and dirt bikes, and so racing was always fun to do, and we always drag raced out there. So started doing RC cars, and then once I was old enough to drive, just kind of naturally started getting into the car scene a little bit. And that's kind of when the whole Fast and the Furious thing was kind of building up, and late 90s import stuff was coming out, VTEC and Honda swaps and stuff like that. So kind of stemmed from there. And of course, late 90s, mid 90s, just the Supra was kind of the holy grail, the NSX, the Supra, the RX-7. And, we didn't have any Skylines over here. So we kind of loved the Supra and all that. And early on, out of high school, I ended up buying a brand new Honda Prelude. And just because I liked the car, had a pretty good job and could buy a new car. And so started modifying that and got in with some local guys, and went for a ride in a good friend's Integra that happened to have a supercharger on it. And I was just hooked after that. So every time I see this guy, he's kind of in and out of the racing scene through the years, but I always tell him, it's your fault I'm even into this. So, we kind of got into the street racing scene, and then we had a local track here, so we could go down and run at the track, and of course not get chased by the cops and all that stuff. So we started going to the track and learning, what a 60-foot was, how to stage a car, do a burnout, all that stuff. And the Prelude was a 2-year project that I kind of messed around with. I think it made 300 wheel. I put a supercharger on it and did some other stuff, and decided I wanted to get a little deeper into the drag racing. So I bought a shell of an Integra and was going to build a drag Integra. And that was kind of the beginning of the standalone engine management time, 2001-ish, I guess. And guys were going maybe like 12 O's here. It was really nothing spectacular, but most of the muscle car guys weren't going much faster then. So
suffice to say, things came along pretty quickly over that period of time.
So it kind of morphed from that. And, I had this big plan to build a drag Integra, but in the back of my mind, I just really wanted a Supra. One of my best friends growing up, his dad had a Supra. And if we cleaned the garage and mowed the grass and, did everything right, he'd let us take it out on the weekends. And so we just get to cruise. It wasn't even turboed, it was NA. So I'd just get to ride in that thing. And so, going full circle, I really just wanted a Supra in the beginning and in the end. And so I kind of scrapped that Integra project and just said, I got to find a Supra. And I found one clear across the country and flew out there and drove it home. And I bought it from the guy, and I shook his hand, and he says, what are you going to do with this thing? And I said, honestly, I'm probably going to make it one of the fastest ones in the world. And he just died laughing. And, so
yeah, hopes and dreams.
Yeah, not that I ever made mine one of the fastest, but it's pretty well known, and it was kind of a long plan.
So that was the original Supra that you still to this day are drag racing?
Yeah, I've only owned. I tell everybody I've only owned one Supra.
Wow.
And I bought that car in 2002, and I still got it.
All right, let's talk about the skill sets that you've sort of developed, because you're obviously well known for your wiring and your tuning, both of which are tricky to learn. So how did that come about? Was that through necessity, just wanting to tinker and modify what was your Prelude and obviously later on the Supra? Or give us some insight into that.
Yeah, so I guess during the Prelude days, it was VTEC AFC. It's really what you could get. And,
absolutely.
Vortec FMU or whatever, 4-to-1 fuel pressure regulator, try and get the injectors to stretch. So it really kind of started with that. So as we got into the Supra, the first sort of popular standalone that was out was the AM. It looked so cool to just plug in and skip the stock ECU and get into the software. And so that really sparked my interest. And I was kind of done just up, down arrows and, dealing with VPC and these different things. I was just sick of the piggyback stuff on the other platforms. So I sort of just dove right in, and I had no idea what I was doing, which is probably how 90% of the people start any of this stuff, whether it's tuning or wiring or even mechanical stuff. It's the same process. I didn't know much, but I was eager, and I would just study the software and try and learn things. And where I live, there's not a huge motorsport presence. So it's a little better now, but back then there wasn't anybody that could do that sort of tuning. There was no remote tuning back then.
The industry is very different now for sure than what it was back at that time, which you were basically learning in the same sort of time frame when I came up and started tuning as well. So I feel your pain. I know exactly what you went through. Yeah,
and looking back on that, I mean, you didn't really realize it at the time, but you're kind of pioneering all this stuff in this industry.
100%.
Guys like you were doing what I was doing, clear across the world, and now we know each other just through the trade and the sport. But I sort of just got into it by doing it, and that's exactly how I got into racing and mechanical stuff and wiring as well. It just kind of became a necessity. If I wanted to use this product and get the most out of it, then I kind of had to figure it out. And I had some people that kind of started me up, kind of teaching me the ropes of how tuning worked and that sort of thing. But we'd already, when I first bought that ECU, nobody in the state had a wideband lambda sensor. I mean, we were like reading plugs when we were racing.
It's a scary way of tuning, but I mean, there's a lot of people who have been doing it for a lot longer than we have with nothing more than reading plugs. So, you could argue it is still a viable technology. What I would say is, because this argument does come up quite regularly, or maybe not argument, question comes up about reading spark plugs. And I'll say, yes, 100% you can read plugs. And when I'm tuning something high power on the dyno, I quite often will do a plug cut and have a look at the plugs, because yes, of course, there's a lot of information you can tell. What I normally see though is people pulling out plugs that have been in the engine for the last 40,000 miles. It's been idling for God knows how long, and the plugs come out black with soot. You're not learning anything from those plugs. There is a technique used if you want to do a plug read. The other aspect, which I think is equally important to understand, is when you're dealing with a carburetor and tuning by looking at plugs or constant flow mechanical injection system, you don't have the granular ability to change the fueling at every site like you do with modern EFI. So generally, if you're kind of in a ballpark, and I am simplifying this, if you're kind of in a ballpark and the plugs read okay, you're probably good to go. But I mean, as you and I both know, you could have a perfect air fuel ratio at 7,500 RPM and 40 pound of boost, and you could be lean or rich at 500 RPM beyond that, and that's the difficulty with plug reading. So I digress a little bit off track, but I just wanted to sort of jam that in there.
Yeah, and I think guys that kind of came up, so to speak, during the time that I did, most of us kind of learned backwards. So the wideband became just something that you had to invest into. I think I paid $900 for my first one, and it made things so much easier. And then I could apply that to the data log and look at the data backwards. Instead of like reading the plug backwards, I could look at the data sort of backwards and see what happened, and then look at the plug for reference and say, well, how did this change? What was the difference? But kids nowadays, every car you buy, it's got a AEM strapped to the A pillar or something, some sort of wideband that just makes things very simple. So
I think when I first got into tuning, the widebands that were available, I think there was about 2 brands. I forget the name. One of them might have been Horiba or something of that nature. And these are lab
I had the
grade.
FJO. The FJO was a big one. Yeah,
but I mean, again, off the top of my head, you were talking back then sort of $2,000-3,000 for a wideband, and I mean, we're sport for choice now, a couple of $100, and you're going to get a good quality LSU 4.9 controller and sensor, and you're good to go. It's just people who are just getting into this, they do not realize how lucky they are with the technology that is available at a reasonable price these days. I just want to also circle back. You said with that prelude, you were talking like VAFC, I think that was the name of it.
VTEC AFC, yeah.
VTEC AFC. So it gives you the ability to move the VTEC changeover point, which obviously every Honda fanboy thinks is the key to unlocking at least another 100 kilowatts. But it also let you vary basically cheating the load signal to the ECU at various RPM breakpoints. And it sounds crude, and it is, but the reality is, for a lightly modified, naturally aspirated Honda, I actually still did a stand-up job for probably a tenth or a quarter of the price of a full standalone. So, it's important to say there is a place for different products, and a full standalone is not always going to be a viable or sensible solution. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I never really got into much of the reflashing stock ECU stuff just because, we went VTEC AFC to full standalone. So it no in betweens. And, I kind of joke like with my friends and stuff. I say, well, nothing in moderation. And that's just kind of how I've always been. I just kind of go off the deep end when I start something, and whether it be surfing or, doing racing or anything, it's really not a very small endeavor to begin with. So I just kind of take that big chunk, bite it off, and just start figuring it out. And, that's how it went for me in racing. I just had to figure this standalone thing out and post on the forums and read stuff constantly. And as I look back now, anything that I want to learn now, and I constantly find myself learning the older I get, which makes life much more enjoyable. And you hear those people say, the more you know, the less you actually really know. And anything I want to learn, I can look it up on YouTube if I want to learn how a CNC works or something. I mean, there is so much information out there. And with what you guys have with HP Academy, if I had that in 98, 99, 2000. I mean, my road would have been much more streamlined.
We built what I wanted back when I was learning, so 100% couldn't agree more. On that note as well, I think that there's a level of people I see getting into the tuning, or for that matter, the wiring or the engine building industry at a hobbyist enthusiast level these days. And there's a certain element of, you tune one car or do whatever it is. And a lot of people kind of, it goes smoothly, so they think they're an expert. And I think there's a level of the Dunning-Kruger effect in there that initially you sort of think that you've mastered it and become an expert, and as you've just mentioned there, the longer you're in the field, the more you realize you've still got to learn, whereas those who are just early in it, they literally don't even know what they don't know. So I think it's really important in any endeavor to have an open mind and realize that no matter how smart you are, no matter how well you've done, that there is literally just always more that you can learn. For me, that's why I'm still passionate about this industry, though, because there's always something new out there. The technology is shifting, and that means that I never know everything. It's great.
Yeah, and a lot of times people ask me, well, why do you drag race? You're in the car for 6 seconds, and that's not a lot of time, and you spend all this money and weeks and months preparing. And I tell everybody, I drag race because it's fucking hard.
It is.
Everybody thinks it looks so easy. And, sometimes you make a pass and the thing is on rails and it just goes down through there and everything was great. But getting that tire on the edge and getting it to work, it's never all the power right now from the hit all the way down. Getting all of those things to work and using your subsystems and your power management, that is the journey in it as much as it is the adrenaline of the pass. And really the adrenaline of the pass is not always as cool for me as it is the competition. I mean, I just fucking love racing people. I love lining up against people. And the adrenaline of that part, the competition, is what I love. It's not that I just am like an adrenaline junkie and I got to go 200 miles an hour every time I get in the car. I love being up against the other guy in the other lane. You got your setup. You don't know what he has. You're going for it. He's going for it. Everything's on the line and it's up to you to deliver. And in drag racing, it's always a pretty clear-cut winner. We don't have judges like Formula Drift or anything. So it's, this guy got there first, this guy left, there's lights. And so I love that part of it. And it's not just this crazy adrenaline that you get from it. So.
Yeah, definitely. And There's so many elements to it, and it is such a deceptively complex sport. But I know a lot of people will look at drag racing and go, well, I mean, you're going in a straight line for 6 seconds, 7 seconds, 8 seconds, whatever it might be. Like, well, how hard is that? You don't even turn the steering wheel, just push the accelerator and go. How boring. And the reality, of course, is if you're looking at a car that's doing 13, 14, 15-second passes, well, pretty much, yeah, it is that within reason. But, you know, as you go faster and faster and you're right on the limit of traction and the track's evolving during a meeting and, you know, maybe a car's oiled down somewhere ahead of you, there is a lot more to it. For me as well, primarily as an engine builder and an engine tuner, what I loved about drag racing is ultimately that's the proving ground for your craft. You know, you can see cheated dyno sheets anywhere on the internet, and you know they don't mean
Certainly.
shit really. But when the lights, when that tree comes down and you go, your ET and your mile an hour to those who know what they're looking at, those will really tell you everything you need to know about exactly how much power that engine really is producing. And then, as you say, you get into all of these little intricacies like the power management, the strategies you're using to get that car down the strip. And there's just levels to this stuff that I love. I mean, it's a very different sport to, or very different discipline to road racing. And the old story is you pay more and more money to spend less and less time in the driver's seat of drag racing, which on face value makes no sense. But yeah, I do. It's been a while since I've gone down the strip, but I do still remember my old Evo pulling fourth gear, where you sort of had a second or so to relax before you hit the chute, and you know
You're
that
just fucking,
feeling
like,
on a good
holding
pass is
on.
like, yeah, this is something very few people will experience.
And that's the thing is everybody thinks, well, you're going straight. It's easy. You let off a button, but you only, like I said, you only do that when the car is just dialed. But
Yeah.
you get your personal best and you know what the car is going to do. But the other part that not a lot of people talk about is, you know, to be at a higher tier of this stuff, it takes a lot of balls. I mean, these guys that have God knows how much money into an engine and are willing to say, you know what, I'm going to put 80 pounds of boost in that. And I'm going to turn on 2 kits of nitrous, and I don't give a fuck if it blows up. And by the way, I'm going to strap myself into this thing and
Keep your eyes closed and hope.
yeah. And you know, people don't understand, like it's a rush and it's all those things, but it takes a lot of guts to get in those cars and drive them hard and put the tune up in it.
Yeah.
And just know you're going to send that thing and, you know, blow it up, light it on fire. I mean, whatever. And so there's guys that are willing to do that and get in the cars. And, you know, I for one, I build my own car, I tune it, I drive it. There's not a lot of guys that do that. A lot of guys have a tuner, or they have a car and they hire a driver and a tuner.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. There's another couple of elements there that you've just mentioned that sort of, I think are worth diving into, which again, are just so easy to overlook. So again, sort of coming back to what I mentioned there with the drag strip essentially being the ultimate dyno, the ultimate proving ground. The other thing that I liked when I was drag racing, and I mean, you're at the top of your game with what you're doing on the 2JZ Supra platform, you've got the ability then to see how good you are on a world stage. A drag strip is 400 meters long in New Zealand. It's 400 meters long in Australia, the US, everywhere in the world. So literally, we're in this situation where, you know, people are trading PBs, world records, and straight away you see how good you really are. So I really loved that about the 4G63 platform. Yeah. I bowed out when I was at the top, so that's moved a long way. But yeah, I'll take that as a win.
Michael Jordan style. Yeah. You stepped out of it at the right time.
Yeah, exactly.
Your wallet appreciates you.
And the other thing I'll just mention as well, you talked about, you know, these people being prepared to blow up engines, and we quite often get asked with people getting into tuning, like, oh, how many engines do you have to blow up before you learn how to tune? And my answer is always the same. If you understand the principles, you're doing your job properly, you should not be blowing up any engines. I firmly believe that you don't need to blow up engines to learn. However, there's levels to this as well. I mean, we're talking a street car with 100 horsepower more than stock. There is absolutely no reason in the world that a tuner should be breaking that engine. However, you start taking a 2JZ and you want to punch out 2,000 plus horsepower. or you're trying for world records, you are in uncharted territory and you're pushing the components so hard that no one knows what they're capable of. And unfortunately at that level, yes, things will break. You have to find out where those weak points are so you can address them, fix them, and come back stronger. And unfortunately, that can be an incredibly expensive learning curve. So that's kind of something that we have to accept if we want to compete on that stage. Would you agree with that?
Sure, but I think that if you're involved either as an owner or a driver, or you're lucky enough that somebody's hired you to be a tuner in that scenario, you're just going to do nothing but learn from the situation, because it's last year in 21 we were able to keep upping our PB in a couple of the cars that I work with and in my personal car, and you sort of get to that uncharted territory where you barely nick your personal best and you go, okay, what are we going to do now? And it kind of comes back to having the guts to say, well, we're going to try 10 more pounds of boost if the turbo will make it. And, we're going to try and 60-foot the car harder. We're going to use more nitrous, and we're going to see what that does. And when that thing hooks and works and goes, I mean, you can't back out of it. You're along for the ride, and you pull back and you look at that data. And like I tell everybody, my car is kind of a science project. I mean, I got so many sensors and anti-wheelie, and GPS stuff has been in and out of there. And so turbo speed versus temps, and you start diving into all these different data points. And really, it's really cool for me because I get to just learn that, You see other guys that get hired on various projects like Shane T and stuff. And he's been further down that road because he's been fortunate enough to be hired by these people and do these wazoo projects, whether it's on the salt or drag racing. And so you get exposed to different projects and things, and you see different data and you try different things and you just learn stuff all the time. So
I would say that there's a benefit in my mind as well of doing this on your own stuff versus doing it on a customer's car as well. I personally think, I think there's a sort of a duty of care when you're dealing with a customer's car within reason. I mean, obviously, if they're shooting for world records, well, everything I just mentioned sort of goes without saying. It is what it is. You're
Sure.
on the limits. But I mean, I personally was always quite happy to push my own equipment a little bit harder than what I'd do for a customer, because at the end of the day, I didn't want unhappy customers.
But you start to just be able to have the answers in the future. So, so to speak, if somebody comes to you and they say, well, how much can you turn a 2JZ up before the head gasket's a problem? You can say, well, I don't know, stock head gasket, maybe 50 pounds, maybe 45 pounds, depends on the turbo. Are you using nitrous? Are you not using nitrous? But also that starts to carry over into other platforms, So, I mean, I the stuff that I do tuning wise for the side-by-sides and that, I've been able to pass some of this knowledge, just cross it over into that platform, because we start to push those things harder and harder. And then, as far as a head gasket solution or a sleeve solution, I've already been exposed to it on the tuning side of things, and you get nitty gritty and granular with the data and the engine building, and it just starts going down all these other paths and things and sensors and gathering data to be able to make decisions. And so it helps your clients down the road. So you're constantly learning, and just the applying of that to other projects is super critical. There's a lot of tuners and stuff out there that don't drive, they don't have their own cars, and so they're always testing it on other people's stuff. And like you said, if you're going for world records, that's all off the table. But if they're learning on somebody else's equipment, then that can have its own set of circumstances. So
yeah, absolutely. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the Supra, since we're a fair way down the rabbit hole already. So last time we caught up was at Texas 2K back in 2019, from my memory.
19, I think, yeah.
And I think at the time you were running a cast iron block 2JZ, because we discussed that at some length. And I understand you've now moved to both a billet block and a billet head. This is always a bit of a controversial subject, because I know there's a lot of people out there in the belief, rightly or wrongly, that you replace the cast iron block with a billet aftermarket block and it's no longer a 2JZ. I'm not really interested in sort of arguing for or against that, but at a point where you want to make more power and the factory componentry starts becoming a limit, you've got to start looking at options. Is that where you were sort of at or about the limit of the cast block when you decided to make the change?
Yeah, for sure. I think we had that conversation during our interview there at 2K, and I pretty much said billet block's our next move. And shortly after we made that move, because as you start to look at data, you start to see coolant pressure rise, and that can just be catastrophic in a drag car.
And when you say coolant pressure rise, generally you're monitoring that coolant pressure, and that's really a direct indication if that pressure climbs that you've breached or failed the head gasket, correct? You're getting combustion pressure into the water
Correct.
jacket.
And then if you breach or fail the radiator in the car, then you're failing the traction of the car and potentially crashing it at a high rate of speed. And so the safety concern alone is a good move on a billet block, just from that perspective. Certainly, there are guys that have gone faster on a cast block than I did. I had seen it done. I knew it could be done. Different head gasket solutions, but nothing that was really long-term great choices. And so you just get to that point where you got to make that investment and make a move to a billet block, and head gasket sealing starts to go away.
Let's just talk about that element, because that's sort of always the fuse that, in my mind, that limits how much power we can produce out of these high boost, small displacement import engines. At some point, the cylinder pressure becomes so high that just keeping it within the cylinder becomes a real problem. So it sounds like the rest of the block integrity, the bottom end, etc., wasn't really a problem, and head gasket integrity was what drove finally that choice to go billet.
For sure. I mean,
Okay.
as we progressed through the years, we used to run no fill in the coolant system as far as cement or hardening. We used to run a stock style head stud, and my engine program sort of started earlier off with the 1/2-inch head stud. And most people don't run that now because the materials are better to run a stock head stud sizing. Then we had problems with the stock main caps, so we created billet main caps, and then steel rods going to aluminum rods and clearancing the block and everything for that. So it just kind of progresses up to where you can start to make more power and these other components can take it. And then really the issue is just keeping that head gasket sealed and keeping the water pressure down.
So can you give us an indication of what sort of power level / boost pressure you were at, kind of at the point where you moved from cast?
So at Texas 2K, I'd moved my personal best from, I don't know, maybe a high 7 or mid 7 at that time. And I think I went 727 or 721 a few times at Texas 2K. And between rounds, we had a rainstorm, and I looked at the data, and the coolant pressure was starting to go to about 60 PSI or so, which, to give you a data comparison now, my coolant pressure in my current engine is about 9 PSI. So you'd see the boost come up to 60, 62 pounds of boost or so, and the coolant pressure would just rise right up, and then it'd be the end of the pass, and you could shut it down. And luckily, didn't have any major problems. But I've lifted a head on the dyno one time. I've seen the coolant pressure go to 80 pounds, and it stretches the radiator. Obviously, it would have blown the radiator hoses off, but we all run AN fittings and hoses, so everything stays on there pretty well. But, I think that's kind of the range, like low 60s, mid 60s is kind of where I started to see a problem. And I didn't run any sort of fire rings or hoops or anything on that engine. It was a OEM gasket with a 1/2-inch head stud. Like I said, it was kind of an older combination.
As you mentioned, there's obviously different solutions that you could have gone down that might have got you a little bit further. So you're definitely not saying that that's the limit of the cast block, just to be really clear.
For sure. I mean, E-Canoe went 5s on the cast block, so it's you can make it work and do things. But for me, I had been watching that data historically, and I knew what was there. And as I turned the boost up, I'd check these different channels and I'd see it. And I knew the recipe that was forming. And plus, hell, I just wanted to run more boost and everything else. So I just said, let's make the move and go for it and get a different head gasket solution at the same time. So.
Yeah, why not? Okay, so moving to that billet block. And I understand you've actually gone to a billet cylinder head as well. Was that move made at the same time, or were these two separate upgrades?
Two separate moves. So we went 687 and 681 at Hail Mary Derby 2021. And we were sort of going for it after that 81 pass because the record was an 80 for Jack Kudo for the Supra IRS world.
Yeah, sorry, we should have probably also mentioned, because people are probably listening thinking, well, Supras have gone much faster than this, but this is the IRS independent rear suspension, so which puts you at a significant disadvantage compared to going to a proper four-link.
Sure, that and the weight that we run the cars at, they're still got full glass and steel doors and, not a bunch of weight reduction and things. So my car is 3,250 pounds that I race it at. That's the class it fits in for World Cup finals. And so I kind of leave it in that trim throughout the year. And that's about where Jack's car was too. He was fortunate enough to go 680 at Texas 2K 2020 before the event got shut down. And he sort of reset the world record at that time for the Supras IRS. And I had gone 687 at the Hail Mary Derby in May of 21 and thought, well, I saw the Lambda was way off because I started to use a little bit more of the one of the nitrous kits. And so I knew I had to lean that out a little bit, and I knew there was a little bit more there. And so I ran it again, and it went 681, and I think it went 441 in the eighth or 442. And we had one more shot to run it, and I said, well, I don't really give a shit at this point. I want the record. I know what it needs, and I threw some more at it, and it went 109 60 foot, 289 in the 330, and 436 in the eighth. And at 402 in the run, the turbo exploded.
Ouch. So
I didn't get to make the rest of the run. But that would have been a hell of a pass. I don't know, people I talked to, oh, that would have been in the 60s, it was a high 60, and some people say, that would have been a 58, and who knows what the hell it would have ran, but that's kind of what we're still chasing is getting back to that point. And the previous few races we had gone to, both my car and Tony Phillips's car, you've had him on Tony's car mentioned on some of your stuff, and he's an IRS guy, and we kind of rotate or we kind of race out of the same camp, share data, and the cars are damn near identical. Tony and I, as well as several other 2J racers, we were just fucking over the cast stock OEM cylinder head. So we found the limits of the block, and we just kept finding, 6 passes, 8 passes, we were damaging the cylinder head. We were cracking an exhaust port because we were having them ported so heavily to make the power that they were weak, or we were bending valves because we were putting bigger valves in them, or, the cooling wasn't there, or whatever the situation was. So we had both really wanted to make the move away from the cast cylinder head. The other problem that we had is there was a point in time where we just couldn't get a cylinder head. Just Toyota had 400 on back order in the US. So you couldn't get one. And when you got one, you would have to put, I don't know, $8,000+ into modifications. It had to be welded. The water jackets to run a dry deck. We'd have to cut the O-ring grooves for the head gasket style we'd run. We'd have to clearance it for high lift cams. We'd have to clearance it for the head studs. And then, of course, all the porting, which has to be shipped out to a couple of different places. Then we'd change all the valve seats. Then we'd do the valve work. And, it's just a painstaking process. And we'd run those things 6 or 8 times or 10 times or sometimes 15 and break the whole damn thing, or it'd be so warped and tacoed out. We'd lift the center of it and not the ends, and just turn the thing into basically a piece of shit and start over again. So both Tony and I were pretty over that, and we wanted to make a move to get into the billet head thing. And so we were kind of the first couple guys to get one. We knew what we were kind of the path we were going down. I think when we were talking earlier, you said anybody who's tried this billet stuff, it's not all roses in the beginning.
Yeah, and I think everyone, on the outside of this, sees, oh, well, billet, that's the answer. And I mean, ultimately, yes, it may be the answer, but just like anything, at this level, there's a learning curve that comes along with this. It doesn't come easily necessarily. And I've spoken to several competitors across different forms of motorsport that have gone to billet engine components, and yeah, they've basically spent a huge amount of time and not an insignificant amount of money getting up to speed with what those blocks or parts need in order to work and be reliable.
Yeah. And the cool thing about Billet is you can make it anything you want it to be. Size-wise, port-wise, thickness-wise, strength-wise. I mean, for the most part, if you can dream it, you can make it.
Actually, on that note, as you say, you've got that ultimate flexibility, and I haven't dealt too much with the 2JZ at the sort of level you're talking, and without trying to get 2JZ fanboys offside with me, from what I understand, given some other better flowing cylinder heads, the 2JZ port shape and size is maybe actually not that favourable for what you're trying to do with it. So, first of all, is that correct? And secondly, if so, are you able to completely fix that with the Billet head?
Yeah, so I think 2JZ guys were blessed with just a brilliant block, and the cylinder head is just kind of shit, especially coming from the Honda world. VTEC, and you look at like K-Series Honda head. I mean,
it's pretty hard to go past a K20 head.
Yeah, it's just beautiful. So if we could put that on the top of a 2J, we'd have a hell of an engine. But the ports are not great. Everything about it just is not great from the factory. So kind of starting from ground zero, we could have said, let's make a head the right way. And we're talking K-Series. Let's make it into a K-Series, and let's reshape the ports, and let's change where the mounting holes are for the intake manifold so that all the ports are straight. And let's change the valve angle. Let's do this and that. And really what the conversation turned to is what we have in the stock head works well enough. It's just not strong for what we're starting to do to it. Because a lot of people say, well, Cody, there's a million guys with 2Js that have gone way faster than you. And yeah, I believe that. And obviously it's out there. But as I talk to some of the other 2J guys, and I talk to them through their data and what they're doing, they really, like for Titan, for example, they really don't run that car that hard. They run an 88 millimeter turbo because of their class. They don't use nitrous. And generally they run it at, 70 pounds of boost or so. And, when we were going 680, I had 80 pounds in the car and 2 kits of nitrous, just because the car is heavy, it's IRS, it just doesn't work well enough until you start beating the shit out of it.
So you got to fix your deficits with power, basically.
Yeah, so we're running the car harder than people think to get that ET. And so that is just much harder on the engine components. And so I feel like we kind of get down this road quicker than people realize because, like I said, I'm not really that lackadaisy about running the car hard. If it's time and the track is there, let's do it. And I love racing that guy next to me, like I said. So, but we need the longevity to get through the rounds, and we need the longevity, race to race. And so that's kind of why we went Billet, and we said, we just need something that is going to be similar to the OEM head to start with, but in Billet. And so that's where we started.
I mean, I guess the other element that is worth considering there when you're weighing up your options, I mean, yes, obviously you could do anything you want starting with a clean sheet of paper, but that 2JZ aftermarket is really well developed. You've got quality aftermarket inlet manifolds from a range of manufacturers that are designed to bolt on to an OE 2JZ head. So you'd have to start from scratch on that front. Likewise, the exhaust manifolds, likewise the valve train, the cams, it goes on and on and on. So yes,
valve covers, cam seals. I mean, it just comes down to so many things.
And yes, you could address every single one of those things that we've just mentioned, but at what expense in terms of both time and money? So yeah, I mean, I think it's a sensible solution. If you've got something that's workable and you just want it stronger, well, have at it. Yeah, let's just redevelop basically the OE geometry. Now, how well did that work out when you hit the dyno?
Well, the dyno is where we began to learn, I guess you could say. Once I got the product in hand, I was really impressed with the fit and finish of everything on it. The manifolds bolted up nicely. It came with valve covers. The cams dropped in. Everything had clearance. We had made a different spring for that head because the spring pocket is deeper. So we were able to, down the road, to run a higher lift cam and not get into bind with that. So we kind of had a custom part in there, but everything else pretty much dropped in. The OEM buckets slid in and out real nice. The valve guides all went in real good. Everything looked really nice. I was really impressed with the workmanship and everything of the the cylinder head. I think when we start looking at drag racing in general, and we're looking at engines at this level very deeply, we start to look at the domestic market pretty heavily, because we see these guys, they're going faster. What are they doing? And they've had billet blocks and Proline and, 481X, these cool engines. What, Alan Johnson, these guys, what have they been doing? And so you try and get little tidbits out of what you can find online. But really, you see a lot of guys, they don't run water. And a lot of the 5-second 2J guys, they don't run water. They've got a sealed head, and they fire it up in the staging lanes, do the burnout, run it and turn the thing off and bring it back to the pits. And, they'll go a whole race or a couple of races and then tear the engine down and do it all over again. And so we kind of were going back and forth. Do we run water? And really the question is why not run water? What's the real downside? We're not quite the chassis pro mod type of Supra, more or less. And if we want to fire it up and run it a few times, not have to cool it down for 3 hours, so to speak, it'd be nice to have the water in there and have a radiator and a water pump and all that stuff. So the head was designed with water. And the first time we put it on the dyno, I put it on a main line shortly before an event, and wanted to just work it through the paces, and, ran it 20 pounds of boost, 30 pounds of boost, 40 pounds of boost, and just looked at things, and everything just lined up really, really well. But I kept looking at plugs and pulling things out, and really noticing just the surface temperature of the aluminum was quite different than the cast. When I changed plugs, the valve covers were just hotter than usual, but coolant temps, 170 Celsius, Fahrenheit.
I hope not. And there was a melted puddle on the floor.
Yeah. 150 Fahrenheit, no problem. Whatever I commanded the coolant fan to turn on and off at, it kind of held that temperature. So I thought, well, hell, the thing's running cool on the sensor. Maybe I'm just paranoid. And I ran it, made 1,300 or so, and I said, okay, let's give it some shit, and made 1,600, 1,800, and when I ran it at 1,800, I turned it off. Well, actually, no, I had just checked the plugs, made 1,800, and I said, okay, before everything gets too hot or whatever, let's run it one more time, and then we'll check everything. And I went to fire the car up, and it didn't sound right. Just didn't sound like it wanted to start right, like the compression was down. I thought, shit, the compression's down in this thing. That's weird. Maybe we heard a valve. Maybe we did this or that. And so naturally pulled the plugs out of it. All the plugs look good. Don't really know what's going on there. I thought, well, we've had problems like this in the past. Sometimes we run the cars really hard at the racetrack, and they don't really want to start up again because the exhaust valves tend to bend. And we sort of kind of worked that problem out. I wouldn't say we're 100% there, but I thought, well, maybe the valves are slightly bent. So I decided to fire the car back up, and it took a little bit of throttle and a little bit of running the starter and working it. And we get it to fire up, and I just sit there and let it idle. I check temps, EGTs, all 6 cylinders are burning good. I think, well, maybe the valves are just a little tweaked. I don't know. Let's run it again. Run it again. Thing makes over 2,000 wheel, and I turn it off and try to start it back up, and it has trouble starting. So
this is now a 2JZ rotary.
Yeah, you could put it that way.
Makes good power, but hard to start. Okay, good.
Yeah, so we thought, well, I said, I'm going to take the car home. I've got 10 days or so before my race, look at everything, maybe take the head off. And I figured we put it through the paces. We made 2,000, nothing split in half. All the bearings, looked good. Everything, there wasn't shavings of metal everywhere. So we're off to a decent start. And I brought it home, did a compression test, leaked down. The numbers were pretty terrible. Pulled the head off, and everything looked okay, but the valves and the seats looked like they had started to tweak a little. And so in a mad dash, 5 days before the biggest race of the year, we just decided we'll go to the race. We'll fix the cylinder head. We didn't have another head at all because we couldn't get the damn things that whole year. We had troubles getting them. And we'd kind of made this decision to work the problem, work the development of this billet head, and kind of, like I said, knew what we were biting off more than we could chew, but we knew what we were up against. And so put some new valves in it, touched up the seats, and put the car back together and everything worked just fine. Then we started to make passes with it. Now, the difference here is the dyno is a great tool to learn things and run the car on and kind of put the thing through its paces. It's great because you can run your boost control, you can test nitrous, you can sort of make sure everything works mechanically. When you put the thing on the track, it's still a different animal. And in hindsight, looking back on data, there were some points there that I sort of missed that would have helped us at the track when we started having problems, because the first time we made a pass, we couldn't make it past the 8th mile without the car severely misfiring. The thing would just go flat. We run M&W CDIs, and most of the cars I do, it seems like most guys run a CDI or an IGN 1A combination coil. And the car's never misfired, no matter how rich I ran it or anything. My car and Tony's was doing the same thing. And really, we pull them back to the pits. And, well, you need to run the car richer. We're talking to the guy who makes the head. You need to run it richer. Let's look at your data. We're all putting our heads together. We're all trying to come together. Tony Palo walks over to my pits and he's talking to me about it. And he says, well, maybe these domestic guys, they're not so crazy after all, because you talk to these guys and they run a target lambda of like 0.42. Maybe they're just running it so damn rich. It's the only way to keep the billet cool. And I thought, well, hell, maybe you're right. So we run it at 40, 45, and the car still won't go through there. It's misfiring. So really just the aluminum, the billet is stronger, but it just has very different thermal characteristics. And we knew that going into it with the block and a billet rod, aluminum rod. They act a lot different on the bearing than a steel rod. And really what we found was this valve train situation is tricky, because a lot of guys that run billet heads, they run them without water, in the V8 domestic world, and guys run quarter mile, guys run 8th mile. So it's not really an issue of, are you getting the water temp cool enough around the combustion chamber? Is it more or less, is the billet material getting so hot that it starts to get other valve train items out of clearance? So really what we found was the head was growing so much that it would just squeeze down on the exhaust guides. Okay. And actually slow down the exhaust valve. And upon inspection, tearing the head off, I had that head off the car probably 4 times at World Cup finals alone. Make a pass, tear the head off, make a pass, tear the head off. I mean, it was a terrible experience from that perspective, but you could actually see the bronze guide marrying into the alloy on the valve.
So is this ultimately a clearance issue? Is that the resolution to it, or does it go a bit deeper than that?
Well, it's definitely, you got to run it different, because we have gotten it to the point now where we can make full quarter mile passes.
Always helpful.
Yeah, and so probably save some of that of what we've done there. I probably given away a little too much information to some people, but really trying to figure out what those materials do at certain temperatures and things. Because when I ran the car on the dyno, I was able to go third gear, 9,400 RPM, 200 something mile an hour wheel speed, whatever it was, and make a full pass is what I thought. But really the exhaust gas temperature, when I look back at the data, was the max reading I was getting was about 1,200 Fahrenheit on the dyno. And generally speaking, we've ran the cars every which lambda target on a 2J. And generally speaking, they're 1,300 to 1,350 at the stripe. It's kind of, no matter how rich we run it, what timing, whatever, that's kind of where the thing just runs. And you talk to some of these other tuners in the domestic world, and they're saying, you can't go over 1,200 degrees. You're going to melt the piston. And shit, we've ran them 1,400 plus and never melted anything. So I'm just saying, I'm just speaking for my car, my data, my sensors, don't take this for what it's worth. But on the dyno, it only went 1,200. I was able to make a full pull. And then right at 1,200 degrees in the pass is where the thing would start to have a problem at World Cup finals. So we pretty much knew we had a problem. And by it slowing the valve down, the piston was starting to contact the valve.
Never good.
And we've got a great valve partner with Greg at GSC. Makes all these guys that run 2Js. He makes all their camshafts, and we run his valves and his spring combination. And he's a great partner to work with. And, he was at the track with us, and we took those valves out of the head, and he said, you know what, that's awesome for me. Like this thing was running 9,000 RPM or whatever it was, and the piston hit the thing God knows how many times, and the valve is like barely even tweaked, like it's not broke off or anything. And there's a little mark on the piston, so who knows how hard it was hitting it. But he said, quit running that thing. And I said, yeah, I don't want to break the block or blow a hole in the cylinder head or anything. So we kind of abandoned the race at that point, and are kind of out there in undiscovered territory, no man's land with this combination, and still working through the problems.
So this is still ongoing.
Still an ongoing thing.
Okay.
Tony's car has shown some pretty good promise. He's able to take a new personal best mile an hour in his car. He's gone 215 in that combination. ET was 690 or so on that pass. But really, I think kind of the old adage of to go forward, you got to take some steps back. This is just, I'm definitely living that. And through the frustration, I sort of know I could put a stock head back on the car. I know what it would do. I know its limitations in my combination and what would happen. And I may still do that, but we still want to develop the billet head stuff, because ultimately it's going to be the right choice down the road and the right combination. And, we're sort of frontiering that for all the 2J guys. And
I'm sure they'll thank you in the end.
Yeah, I bet they'll thank me.
Let's just come back to a few of the topics that you've talked about as we've gone through that, and I can only imagine it has probably been immensely frustrating going from a package that you had pretty well dialed, despite the obvious limitations with that factory head. And again, just for those who maybe aren't real familiar, and we haven't discussed the fuel you're running on here. You've kind of thrown around some EGT numbers and some Lambda numbers, which may make absolutely no sense until people understand you're running on methanol fuel, correct? Correct,
yeah. We generally just run the M1 fuel, to be specific, So
a couple of things about methanol fuel, which is pretty much the fuel of choice at the top levels of drag racing where it's legal, is that it has the ability to basically, it's got great cooling properties, latent heat of evaporation. It absorbs a lot of heat out of the inlet charge air and the combustion chamber and everything else as it goes through that phase change from liquid to vapor. So that's one aspect, which is one of the reasons why we can get away with, in some instances, no cooling system at all. The other element with this is that due to the stoichiometric fuel ratio of methanol being 6.4 to 1 versus 14.7 for pump gas, we're running a hell of a lot more fuel into the combustion chamber to match with the air. So the air fuel ratios, the lambda targets that you're talking about, are incredibly rich compared to, you'd never run gasoline at that sort of target. You'd just be rich misfiring. So I just wanted to get those out of the way. On the cooling front, you mentioned your decision to run coolant through the cylinder head. I did the same with my own Evo 4G63, although we had a solid filled block. And I did that weighing up the pros and cons, and decided I wanted the flexibility to be able to idle the car. If someone wanted to hang me out to dry on the tree, I didn't have to worry about overheating the engine while I waited for the competitor in the other lane to come into stage, that sort of thing. I just thought it gave me a lot more flexibility, particularly when it comes to the tuning as well. I didn't really feel like doing a pull on the dyno and then waiting for an hour and a half for it to cool down enough to do another one. You haven't mentioned whether you are also running coolant through the block, or is it just the head?
It's just the head on my combination.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. I wanted to clear that up. The second element, you've talked a couple of times now, alluded to your use of nitrous, and it's pretty common with an automatic transmission, which we haven't talked about, but you've got a 3-speed auto in the car. It can be very difficult to get these turbos up and spooled on the trans brake, and it's pretty common to use a shot of nitrous just to get that turbo to spool initially. After it sort of comes up in the boost, it becomes sort of self-fulfilling and you don't necessarily need the nitrous. I got the impression from what you're talking about, though, you're actually spraying down the track. Is that correct?
Yeah, so as we talked about the 2JZ, it's a great bottom end. Cylinder head sucks. The other thing that sucks about it is the displacement. It's just a small engine. From the likes of, you compare with like the VR38, not only is it a further developed engine, just the displacement of that being able to run 2 turbos through basically a 6-cylinder engine, what some of these guys do. The benefit of the nitrous is you have to use it with the automatic because generally your torque converter is so tight that you have to use the nitrous to bring the torque curve down. And that's why I'm talking about the displacement, is basically make that thing into a big block so it can spool that turbo. And then, you can get up on the two-step and run it down the track or whatnot. So the nitrous just makes the engine more broad in its power and gives it the torque and kind of turns it into those V8 big block kind of things that we're racing a lot of the times. So I'm kind of a nitrous fanboy, always have been. I put nitrous on everything just because I like to use it the right way. A lot of people break a lot of shit, burn a lot of shit on nitrous. It helps the car leave better. And then ultimately, if you want more power down track and you ran the turbo to the limit, that's kind of your next move, is to use the nitrous as well. And really, I'm doing that on my own equipment, trying to learn, like, what is it going to do with 80 pounds of boost and 300 worth of nitrous in it? And now I know.
Now, just on that note, I've had a little experience with nitrous, nothing like you have. I kind of started out probably because of the Fast and the Furious. I put a direct port
grabbing
nitrous
the steering wheel.
Yeah, that's it. I put a direct port nitrous kit on my Evo drag car, and I think I used it once or twice, and really the reason behind that was I just always could make more power on the turbo alone than I could really put to the track, so it sort of became redundant.
Exactly.
You're obviously not in that scenario, but what I wanted to talk about, a lot of people sort of, and I think it comes from that Fast and the Furious, like, well, I've got a 300 horsepower kit of nitrous on demand here, so I'll push the button and I'm obviously going to get 300 horsepower. My take on it is it's not quite as straightforward and cut and dried as that when you're dealing with a turbocharged engine. And there's two elements to the turbocharger. You've got that compressor wheel, which can flow a certain mass of air into the engine. And when we get beyond what the turbo compressor can supply, well, the only a good way of getting additional oxygen into the cylinder and hence making more power is, of course, nitrous. We're chemically supercharging. We're just adding that oxygen straight into the combustion chamber. So on that front, happy days. That's all good. The part that I think a lot of people miss, though, is when you're combusting more fuel and air, by definition, that's creating more exhaust gas as well, which we still have to evacuate out. So what I see, where I'm going with this, is what I've seen with admittedly much smaller turbo combinations than yours is you'll have the turbocharger essentially maxed. You can increase the boost, it makes no more power. And then you add a 200 shot of nitrous and you run it on the dyno, and instead of 200 horsepower, you might get 20 or 50 horsepower. And what you see is the exhaust manifold back pressure just skyrocket the EMAP because the turbo is just strangling on the hot side. Does that sort of make sense? Do you agree with that sort of take on it? Or are you just at the size of turbo you're dealing with, you're not choked on the turbine and that's why you can get away with it?
Yeah, the second piece. Certainly if you use nitrous and you're already into an EMAP situation, you're probably just going to have reversion and create a bigger problem. Generally speaking, we're running a turbocharger that is sized way over what our engine should be, as far as the matchup. And so we don't really get in the 2J with my combination. We don't really get into those EMAP numbers. There's some guys that I talk to that they're running 60 pounds of boost and 85 pounds of back pressure or EMAP. Or if you're a diesel guy, they call that drive pressure. And we just never see that.
So are you, the magic number always used to be sort of a 1-to-1 ratio. And by that I mean, if you can keep the EMAP at or below inlet manifold pressure, that's the sweet spot for a drag application. Yes, you give away some boost response, which we don't really care about so much in a drag application, but is that sort of, am I reading that right? You're there or thereabouts?
Yes. I had a conversation with Marty from Turbo Smart a number of years ago, and he was talking to me about Judd Coughlin's Pro Mod car. And he said, what a lot of people don't realize is the EMAP is obviously choking the engine to where it can't combust correctly, but you need that pressure. You need the gate to close so you can drive the turbo speed. They did something on that car to manage the EMAP by adding another wastegate. I don't know if they had two on there or not per bank, or if they just had one, but they added an additional one just to manage EMAP. And that kind of stuck with me because I've early on started to use the CO2 boost control that's been in M1 from the beginning, where a lot of people use standalone boost control systems for CO2 management, or CO2 as the source instead of just using the turbo that's on the car. And one thing that I found pretty cool with that is I have wastegate position sensors, and so I have two 44 millimeter gates on my combination. A lot of guys run 60 mil gate, a single gate, and I run two 44s. And Tony's car runs a single 60. So we've been able to put CO2 on both cars and look at the data side by side. And one of the things that's always been in the back of my mind is what's the EMAP doing versus that wastegate position? Because if I cram all the CO2 to it, the EMAP will go up. The boost will generally go up. But who knows if the ET is going to go up? Generally, you'd say it goes down. But I've always had the tuning approach as to keeping the gates slightly cracked, even if I'm running the shit out of that thing with the nitrous and all that. And you can see that through the position data, and I can close one. It seems like one gate has a little more drive pressure against it. So the same amount of CO2 will almost close one and leave one like 10% open. So it's been really cool to look at that data. And I've always looked really closely at turbo speed as well. And what I have found is by using the nitrous, I don't generally see much more turbo speed. I don't generally see a bunch more EMAP drive. And a lot of that can be just because of the sizing combination. A lot of that could also be because the gates are just slightly open.
I assume as well, though, as you bring in that nitrous, naturally, all other things being equal, it should increase your EMAP. But if you're also not targeting an increase in turbo speed and hence boost pressure, if you're keeping that relatively consistent, I would assume that you are actually seeing those wastegates open further, and hence the EMAP is sort of managed by bypassing more exhaust gas. Is that sort of about right?
Yeah, it depends on how much you're really targeting for boost, because I've got dozens and dozens and dozens of runs that I go back and I look at all of this data very closely at. I will tell you, when I turn the second kit on, that turns enough drive pressure or EMAP to go over 1-to-1 at that point. And that's when I think the engine starts to get in a little more trouble, or you're on borrowed time as far as, potentially hurting something. I don't see it drive a ton of turbo speed out through the roof. We did break a turbo at World Cup finals in 19, and we overspun that turbo. That was pretty much our fault. But I was trying to use both nitrous kits because I was racing Jack Kudo and all that shit was on the line, and we were on the biggest stage in the world, and it was the last race of the year. And, I just love that shit. So I didn't give a damn. We were going for it. He was going for it. And we had a hell of a race, but I broke a little bit around the, 1,000 foot or something. But a lot of people just look at boost or just look at IMAP over EMAP. And I always look at that data, of course, but really starting to dive more and more into turbo speed and looking at it more consistently and versus wastegate position, because you really don't know that you're using all the turbo until the gate's closed. And then, is the turbine housing sized correctly to keep the EMAP in check versus how much air the air pump of the engine is pushing through the whole combination. So I've kind of broadened that scope, I guess, and looked at that. And I think it's been beneficial at managing the car and trying to be creative with power management and whatnot. Because one of the things that we struggled with on these cars is with the automatic and with the big turbo and the nitrous and everything, the tracks were getting so good that we could put 60 pounds of boost in it at the 60 foot mark, or 70 pounds of boost. Whatever the damn thing would make, we could pretty much try and get there. The tire would pretty much take it, is what I'm trying to say. The struggle that we had is we found a point where if we asked for a certain boost curve, that the combination couldn't achieve it between the nitrous, the two-step, everything. If we wanted 70 pounds of boost by this point, we just couldn't get it there. And so really that's where we needed ET, was in that area of the track to get the car to get up off its ass quicker, like it had a shorter gear in it. We couldn't shorten the gear anymore because the thing on the other end is just out of gear. So we're trying to do different things to manage the power, and only by looking at those data points over a long period were we able to come up with some different solutions to try and really just increase turbo speed on the starting line was really the idea.
Let's just sort of circle back on that. So you're basically saying that the limiting factor was the boost pressure that you could leave the line with versus what you could feasibly put to the track at the 60-foot mark and beyond. You couldn't ramp that boost up to that 70 plus PSI quick enough. But of course, leaving the line, I'm guessing, at 70 PSI also wasn't viable because you just blow the tires off it. Is that sort of what you're getting at?
Yeah, the whole combination is tricky because on an automatic car, you can't really leave it at the same RPM like you can a clutch car. A clutch car, you could leave it, 7,000 or 6,500 RPM, bring the clutch out, allow it to slip, have the two-step going to where the thing's making 50 pounds of boost or whatever, and you're managing the power with the clutch. You bring it in and you've got all of the power when you want it. And the boost curve is basically like this, nice and flat, just 90-degree looking. With the automatic car, the torque converter gets the charge pressure in it, and you've got such a small engine, it's hard to run the thing up to 6,000 RPM to be able to get the turbo speed, to get the boost pressure you want. But then again, you can't leave the line with 40, 50 pounds of boost and just instantly hit the tire with the torque converter. It's just going to knock the tire off. So, generally speaking, if you're between that 20 to 25 pounds of boost area to leave on and get the tire to work, and then you want to get after it like you do on a drag radial by just putting a ton of shit to it, you can hit it with the nitrous, but it doesn't really make the turbo just take off like you want with these giant turbos. So you try and use more and more nitrous, and you're asking for a boost curve that you still have, that I haven't been able to achieve, because I want that power from 15 feet out to the 60 foot. I want to increase the ramp rate tremendously.
You want it ramping up at a sort of a 70-degree angle, and you're getting a 40-degree angle.
Put the shit to it right now, and everybody'd say, well, just use the nitrous. Okay, well, we've used not only one stage, but two stages of nitrous and not had a tremendous gain there, because it's a small engine, it's a big turbo, and it just takes time for the systems to react, and the CO2's got to push the gates closed, and because you're leaving with the gates open, you're only applying so much CO2 because you're only trying to leave at 20 pounds of boost versus 45 or whatever. So typically on a clutch car, they'd use a gate on the charge pipe, or a drive-by-wire throttle. And nobody's really done that with an automatic that I know of, but we've sort of started to implement that as well. And really what we started to find is turbo speed on the starting line is around 56,000 to 50,000. I'd say 56 at the high, 50 at the average. And when the car makes 70, 80 pounds of boost, the turbo speed is more around 85, 90,000. So the idea is, can we leave at 70,000 shaft speed through a throttle on the charge pipe?
Still only deliver a manageable boost pressure.
Yeah, and then close that damn throttle and have the turbo already lit and not have to rely so heavily on the nitrous to do these things. Now, the challenge in that is you start to get into turbo surge, because when you do that with a clutch car, you've got 7,500 RPM that you're running the air through the engine at, and it's more efficient than you trying to do it at 5,500 on a large turbocharger. And so then the engine starts to surge, and so you really can't get you don't have enough airflow and RPM through the engine to really get the shaft speed that you're after, period, whether you're using the nitrous or not. So we never just hold it on the line and spray the nitrous. We use that to get it up, hit the two-step, and then the nitrous turns off because we're on the boost pressure.
Yeah.
But the challenge is get the shaft speed to get the turbo on earlier, with or without nitrous. And also, the bigger the turbo, the easier you can get the thing to surge on this little motor that we come back around to with the 2J. It's a 180-inch motor. And we've got a lot of weight. We're limited on gearing. So this is these complex problems that kind of just keep coming around. We've got a lot of weight. It's harder to move the car. You're trying to work this problem through a lot of different angles, and you start to learn more, try and innovate around this thing. So the benefit for me is I have these ideas in my head, and I have John Reed kind of in my corner to be able to write any sort of deval firmware that I dream up or want to do. And we've been able to develop a lot of cool stuff for power management and, really trying to dial this throttle body thing on an automatic car, being able to get that thing to work, not drop boost pressure too hard because we opened the valve, but then we don't have a lot of RPM because we can't really rev the torque converter up because there's so much charge pressure, even with dump valves. And when that charge pressure builds, it pulls down the motor. And so you've kind of got, and then the nitrous turns back on. So
yeah,
you got this,
there's a lot of shit going on.
There's a lot of shit going on. And, to go forward, you got to take a couple steps back sometimes.
I think a couple of things I'll add there. The next question I was going to ask was around that surge, because we see that so often on small capacity engines and drag racing where you're running these massive turbos, and particularly with a clutch car, you're typically going to be running across a relatively narrow RPM range down the strip, even from the launch. Maybe it's sort of 7,500 through to 10, 11,000 RPM, but as you say, with the auto being that you're starting off at such a low RPM, that's the danger area where if you're driving that turbo super hard, you're likely to run the compressor into surge. So, I mean, from what you've just explained, it sounds like a perfect scenario for one of those small drive-by-wire anti-surge throttle bodies and some custom John Reed firmware. You've mentioned John Reed's name for those who aren't aware, and we're talking Motec M1 platform here, where if you've got the right set of skills, you can essentially write your own code to make the computer do whatever you want. For those interested in learning more, because we won't dive into that further here, we have already had John Reed on the podcast, so we'll drop a link in the show notes that you can follow if you want to listen to that interview. Now, in terms of the boost control, you've mentioned here a couple of times CO2 boost control, and I'd like to get a bit of an understanding from you of why we use CO2 rather than just boost pressure onto the wastegates. Where's the advantages of doing so?
The advantages that I see are you've pretty much got control of the wastegates at any given moment with pressure. Because you can run a light spring in it, so you can make them open very easily if you want, or you can make them close very quickly through applying CO2 pressure to the top, or the dome, as a lot of people call it, top of the gate, close the valve, and now all the energy of the engine has to go through the turbine housing. And really that's the key, is being able to manage that on the fly. Now, the turbo itself doesn't always provide enough air to do the things that we want it to do. Now, you can get tricky and run a solenoid to the top of the gate and the side of the gate, or run a 4-port valve. And I've sort of been down all those roads with those different combinations. Some can work well, some do not.
The CO2 control, because you can run such a high regulated pressure, like let's say your maximum boost pressure is 80 psi, but as you've mentioned, you might be leaving the line at 20, 30 or whatever. So you've got a really wide delta from your lowest boost to your highest boost. And most people think, well, that's fine, pneumatic control of the wastegate, we can do that. But there is a limit. You've got your minimum boost pressure, which will be set by the stiffness of the spring in the wastegate, beyond which it just pushes open. And that's going to set our lower level. But I said push open, actually that's the other way around. But with that same spring, a light spring that'll get you down to 20 psi, when the exhaust back pressure rises, that's forcing the wastegate open. So it's actually a limiting ceiling of how much you can run with that same spring. But whereas I'm not sure what pressure you're regulating your CO2.
We generally run it at 100 psi flat.
Yeah, okay. So you've got much more pressure to work on the wastegate than you've ever got from the turbo alone, and specifically, when you're targeting those lower boost pressures as well. So consistent control as well.
Yeah, and what people get caught up on or stuck on when they look at some of the data, if they're looking at EMAP, they're probably saying, okay, I got 50 pounds of boost in the manifold, in the intake manifold, and I've got 50 pounds of back pressure. I'm 1-to-1. I'm good. I only need a 10-pound spring, to keep that gate shut. But in reality, the thermal expansion of the engine and the energy of the combustion is something that isn't really captured or calculated. And you'd be surprised at how much CO2 pressure it takes to close a 60 millimeter valve to try and generate a turbo to get up to, 90 something thousand RPM to generate 80 pounds of boost in the intake manifold. So to give you some data points, for example, my car has 244s. Tony's has a single 60 millimeter gate. To get Tony's car to run 80 pounds in the manifold, we have to use about 140 pounds of CO2 pressure, because that valve is so efficient and that surface area is so big that when it barely cracks, it flows a shit ton of air. With my car, it only takes about 65 pounds of wastegate pressure to make that boost. And that's just something that we've learned along the way. And it's really cool because you can do things on the line with it. You can do things early on in the run when the turbo isn't spun up and available, like you kind of mentioned. And the beauty of it is the PI control in the M1 is so good that you can really target that wastegate pressure, and generally it'll ride with the right control. It'll ride like within about a quarter of a pound.
That's actually worth talking about here. With these control strategies, I'm right in saying you've got a pressure sensor on the wastegate,
correct,
top or dome. So you know what the CO2 pressure in the dome of the wastegate, the top of the wastegate is, which is what's forcing that wastegate closed. So your closed loop control for boost, you're actually targeting a dome pressure target as opposed to a specific boost pressure, and then the relationship between your dome pressure and the boost pressure is a given. So it's a roundabout way of getting boost pressure. Am I right in saying that?
So that's sort of version one of it.
Okay. Is
managing wastegate pressure and saying, I want to target 25 pounds of wastegate pressure. What does that net me in the intake manifold? Not 20. It doesn't give you 25 pounds of boost in the intake manifold.
Of course.
It just gives you dome pressure, which is going to move the gate up or down to a certain position.
So there'd be quite a bit of a learning curve around in that version one, as you mentioned, getting that relationship dialed in between I want 60 psi of inlet manifold pressure. What dome pressure at 9,500 RPM do I need in order to achieve?
Right. And that all changes with the displacement, the turbo combination, the EMAP, the fuel, everything. So you kind of have to figure that out on your car, and then you've got a good idea of how much wastegate pressure to run to make a run. To say I want to make 60 pounds of boost going down the track, it's going to take this number. The version 2 of that is kind of the pie in the sky idea of, wouldn't it be great if the CO2 could be managed by a boost aim of intake manifold pressure, because that's ultimately what we're after. And so version 2 of that does exist. And so now, if I want to run a boost curve and say I want to run, 60 pounds of boost at this point in the track, 70 at this point, 75, whatever, I can just command it in the M1 and it all just magically happens. It's beautiful. Because the system is just so dialed now.
I'm assuming with that system, it would look something in the background like a lookup table, and instead of a duty cycle to the wastegate, which we'd conventionally have, versus RPM for our open loop target or feed forward as it is in the Motec,
yep.
It would be more a feed forward table where you've got a boost target versus RPM, and that feed forward would then be your wastegate dome pressure. Am I reading that right, or not quite?
No, it's even more than that. That there's no duty cycle or feed forward piece to it. It is simply, now it is boost aim at RPM or a timer.
Okay.
Or a gear, and then you're at your net result of boost pressure generally is just right with the aim.
Okay.
So it's been good to have on the car.
All this discussion around boost control obviously begs the question with the likes of Turbo Smart, with their what is now no longer really a new product, their eGate electronic wastegate.
Mm-hmm.
On face value, that seems to kind of be the silver bullet to all of these boost control issues, simplifying the system, albeit with, admittedly, its own set of complexities. Any thoughts on that product, or adopting that for your own application?
I personally have not used them. I think it's something that's been in the back of everybody's mind. Well, it'd be cool if we could just have an electronic motor and not have to worry about a spring and all that. We just control the gate and open and close it, and it'd be great. And that's essentially what we do with the CO2. I think the drawbacks to that system is current draw, but there's ways around that. That's not a problem. So I think that product is a hell of an innovation. I think it's really cool. I've personally never tried it yet because I have 2 gates, so that would get a little bit interesting, and putting 2 of those, as far as fit and finish and space to work with, and then of course wiring that. The other thing too is we air shift the car, so I'm going to need air on board to shift the car and possibly run chutes down the road.
So it wouldn't allow a complete oversimplification of the car.
The nerd in me is like, let's put those things on there and start trying it.
I guess the other element there that you always have to weigh up is you've got a very well-developed system that inside and out. It's proven, it works. It's the old adage of if it isn't broken, don't fix it. I think, and I don't know off the top of my head the numbers, I know TurboSmart quote them. I think there's a misconception as well with these electronic gates that they're instantaneous. They're not. There's still a latency in terms of their movement. So you're still not getting that instant. It can't go from fully open to fully closed in a microsecond. It's a mechanical device. That's not realistic.
Same
so
thing
there's
with
still
CO2.
an element of that.
Yeah.
You mentioned the current draw as well. I'm really struggling to remember because it's so long ago I've talked about this. I think they can draw a maximum of about 20 amps, which is problematic when you're dealing with the likes of an AMP supercell connector where you can really only pull maybe 8 amps maximum through that. So that is a problem, and I think the aftermarket is kind of scrambled to kind of keep up and find solutions around that. But as you say, there definitely are solutions to controlling that wastegate, so it's doable.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, I just want to talk a little bit about one of the more novel aspects on your car, and that's the anti-wheelie control before we finish up, because this is a real problem. If you want to hit that car really hard on the line, it's going to probably get the front wheels up in the air. Obviously, on face value, you'd think, well, wheelie bars are an obvious solution there. But from what I understand, your class rules dictate no wheelie bars. Is that correct?
Most of them, yeah. No wheelie bars. And I think wheelie bars would be tricky on an IRS car to get those to work and get them there. But
I think last time we talked to you about this, it was fairly early on in your testing of John Reed's IMU-based wheelie control, and I'm interested now to sort of get up to speed on it. How's that worked out? How's it developed? Did it do everything you intended?
So it's gone through a few different revisions. Early on, we tried to use a more commonly known IMU on the market, and we didn't have great results with that. So we commissioned our other friend, Sander, who's been on your show as well. And
we'll drop a link to his interview in the show notes as well.
So Sander's probably the guy that will develop Skynet, and we always tease him about that. And he's just a hell of a brain trust there. And
he's the world's most likable car nerd. And this is also sounding pretty incestuous with all of the people that have previously been on our podcast. But hey, I mean, we all know each other, so it goes without saying.
Yeah, small world. But the cool thing about Sander is you think you have an idea, and man, he's probably like 50 miles further down the road than you even thought about being. And so you just kind of trust in his abilities. And we commissioned him to build us a wheelie sensor because he had some ideas with his background with the IMU and the GPS stuff that he's done. And so the first one he built for us, it just worked really well for us. It gave us data, which we were looking for an angle number.
Let's just actually clear that up as well for those who aren't aware of IMU. What you're talking about is inertial measurement unit. So there's a lot of data that comes out of this, but essentially what you're using it is a product that will basically allow you to detect in real time the car pitching up into a wheelie and the angle, and you can actually target a specific wheelie angle, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So we just wanted something that would give us data first. And a lot of people have used laser ride height sensors in the past, and they can be prone to sunlight and distancing, and sometimes the output of them is just a 0 to 5 volt signal, and they got their own set of problems. So we wanted to use something that was a little more advanced. So Sander dreamed us up a sensor, and we had just started using that when we met you at TX2K19. And the firmware was all there, and the data was starting to come in, and the data looked okay, but not great. We were getting angles, but we weren't getting very granular data. The difference between 2 degrees, you think 2 degrees, the car's just barely got the tire height and the thing's just rolling out. But at 4 degrees, it wants to flip itself over. So
you need to be working in tenths of a degree.
You talked about open loop boost control. I mean, this is like even further down that development path. So getting a sensor that gave us good data was tough. Sander basically said that sensor's a piece of trash. Don't tell anybody I ever built it. Throw it in the garbage. And I actually still have it on the car today just because I love Sander. But he then developed something even further with his, I believe it's INS system. And it's got the attached GPS with it. And I can't rattle off of the specs right now, but we've tried that version of the sensor in my car with some devel firmware from John and Sander working together, and been able to get really good data on the wheelie, really good angle data, acceleration data. So that's been beneficial. I guess the sort of problem, which isn't really a problem, it's a good problem to have, is we sort of worked out the wheelie through the chassis of the car in between these 2 reiterations on the sensor. So the car really doesn't wheelie much at all anymore. So I don't rely on the anti-wheelie strategy as much. It's there to basically stop the car from flipping over right now in its current state. Down the road, we get the car lighter. We may try some different things, but Sanders used that in a number of other cars and combinations and things. And so we're just kind of a small piece in that puzzle as far as bringing in data and things on that now. So.
Sure. I mean, if you have the system and don't need to rely on it, that's probably the best case scenario anyway. At least you've got the confidence that if something does change and you end up with the front wheels way in the air, then you're at least not going to flip or do some serious damage to the car. So I think that's probably worthwhile.
Right.
All right, Cody, I think we'll move towards wrapping this thing up. Really great deep dive into your car, which we appreciate. We've got the same 3 questions we ask all of our guests, and the first of those is what's next in the future for you? Maybe related to the drag racing at least. You know, where do you see this going? Where's the finish line for you in terms of AT and mile an hour, or is it just a never-ending quest?
I don't know. Like I said, I've had this car for 20 years now, and it's gone through a million revisions, and the goals move around and change, and it's probably getting close to the limit of where it can run in its current state. You know, like I said, it's not a car that I probably want to take to that real extreme race car level as far as cutting it up, back halving it, straight axle, Lexan, carbon fiber everywhere, at least with this chassis. So it's a pretty nice chassis. It's been rotisserie painted, and everything's powder coated, and it looks pretty good most of the time. So I don't quite know where that's going to go with it. So it's a bit of a conundrum as far as what to do with the car at this point. Obviously, I still love racing. I love to race it in its current trim. So it's smaller refinements at this point, rather than, moving the scale and say, we're going to change this and do this. And so
I think those who are maybe not really deep in the world of drag racing sort of look at a car that's doing 680s and you say you want to go 660 and 0.2 of a second, how hard can that be? But this becomes exponentially more difficult and, of course, exponentially more expensive the faster we want to go. So each tenth of a second is not no mean feat.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a monumental step to move in those tenths when you're already going this fast. And so it takes a lot of changes, and I don't quite know what I'll do with it, to be honest with you. I'll probably leave it the way it is for now for a while and go through try and just step up reliability, work on this billet head situation, and of course, like I said, my car is a bit of a science project. So there's always something in the back of my mind that I want to try, whether it be, with the power management or some of the other subsystems, boost control and whatnot. So
Yeah.
I like it for that reason. And I love just competing and cutting lights against a guy next to me. So I've got the car, it's here, it's ready most of the time. So I love to go to the events, but we'll see what happens.
Okay. Next question. Given what you've experienced in your career, everything you've sort of gone through, the highs, the lows, etc., is there any advice you could give to a younger version of yourself, maybe those listening who kind of maybe want to follow a similar path to maybe fast track their experience, get them up to speed?
As far as advice, I just think just check your ego as much as possible. Like I said, I'm a pretty competitive guy and I can get pretty wound up on things. And earlier on, you and I had that discussion about sort of coming across like, well, I've got this whipped. I can tune an engine. I can run boost control. Like this is easy. And, peeling back the layers of the onion, when you start to understand like the fundamentals of how a crank sensor works and, how an injector works. And like, you really don't know that much. You're just the guy who got a wideband in 2020 versus the guy who got a wideband in 2002. It's just it's just easier to learn and work with the end result than it is to learn from the beginning and build up. So obviously just being open to learn would just be a huge step, and really just diving into the information that's out there now. There's so much on YouTube and your channel, and there's so many guys like me that have done so much of this stuff. And I tell you what, a quick story. I actually went to tune a 4G63 the other day, so that you'll hold this dear to your heart. But there was a kid there. He was, I don't know, maybe 20 years old, and he wired up some injectors, some staged injectors on an AEM version 2, pretty old box. And he said, I don't really know what I'm doing here. This is the first time I've done this. I show up and I've got an appointment. I go on site to check the car, and he says, I know how to do all this stuff mechanically. He's like, but I really don't know shit about wiring, And I said, well, that's fine, dude, because, I build harnesses for a living and do this stuff all the time. And at that moment, I was like, man, I could teach this kid so much right now. And I was there with him for about 3 hours, and they had the map sensor wired wrong. They had the injectors wired wrong. I showed him in the software what it was doing, and he was just mind blown at, the outermost layer of knowledge that we talked about there. And so if you're that kid or guy that is interested in this kind of stuff, like, you really got to listen to the old heads, which, my younger self thought the old guys drag racing, they don't know shit because they're running carburetors and looking at plugs, like we talked about. But those guys know a lot of stuff, and they're super smart, and that experience is just worth so much. So find a guy, offer to work for free for him, offer to just pick his brain, because most of these guys, we love passing on this information or talking about it. For the most part, we're still competitive, we're racing guys, but when you get to the track, there's a lot of guys sharing information. We're all trying to do the same damn thing, and we've all been in the struggle. And the one thing I say about all of this is this shit ain't for quitters. And it's just not. I mean, I have been there, frustrated, 3 a.m., fixing a car, trying to rig something up, trying to make it to the next round. And it is just gut wrenching at times.
I hear you.
And so you got to be a killer. You got to be so driven, and you just cannot quit. This shit is not for quitters. And you just got to have that determination. You're going to have your days, but that determination is going to get you a long ways.
I think the highs and lows of drag racing in particular are extreme, and you do have to be prepared to take the lows along with the highs, because sadly there's normally more of the lows than there are highs. But it only takes one run where everything falls into place and the drag racing gods smile on you, and that makes up for all of the pain that you've suffered leading up to that point. At least that's my experience.
there's a bunch of guys in their mid 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. You'll just find them crying at the end of a drag strip because of what they just did. It's crazy, the highs and lows. And yeah, you got to be able to take your licks because you're going to have some days that pay off too. And those are really good days too.
Definitely.
So.
All right, last question for today, Cody. If people want to find out more about you and follow your journey, where are they best to do so?
Website is codyphillipsracing.com. And then, of course, we're on social for Facebook and Instagram at Cody Phillips Racing.
We'll drop some links in the show notes to all of those resources, and I would urge people to go and check out Cody Phillips on Instagram at least, because unfortunately we're audio only as a podcast, clearly, and we can't do justice to just how pristine this Supra drag car is. And I mean, Cody, we haven't really talked about that element either, but it is, the car is a credit to you. You can build a car to go fast, but building a car that goes fast and also looks like an artwork, that's a whole different level. And I'm pretty confident in saying you pride yourself on not just making the car work like it should, but also look clean and tidy. And that doesn't go unnoticed by others as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's definitely a lot of effort in it through the years. And it's, you always try and put your stamp of showmanship and craftsmanship on everything like that. So there's been a lot of revisions through the years and always trying to make it just one step better. So
no doubt more to come. All right. Thanks a lot for your time, Cody. We look forward to catching up in person soon in the near future. Cheers.
All right. Thanks, man.
If you enjoyed this episode of Tuned In with Cody Phillips, we'd love it if you could drop a review on your chosen podcasting platform. These reviews really help us to grow our audience, and that in turn helps us to continue to get bigger and better guests. To say thanks, each week we'll be picking a random reviewer and sending them out an HPA t-shirt anywhere in the world. This is also a great place to ask any questions you might have too, and I'll do my best to answer them if your review gets picked. So this week, a big shout out to N54 Man, who's asked a question in relation to our interview with Darren from Billet Race Engineering. He's asked, what plans does he have for upcoming Billet blocks? I'd love a Billet N54 block, but the N54 boys are so cheap, I don't know if it'll ever come to fruition. Well, we reached out to Darren and asked him that specific question, and he's replied saying, we get questions all the time about making different Billet blocks. We have two options. We can do a private label block if the client is willing to pay for all of the costs involved in design and manufacturing of the prototype, plus an initial purchase of 10 blocks. Or if we believe that the block they want will sell a certain number of units over a 5-year period, then we'll take the risk and do the project ourselves. Now, ultimately here, reading between the lines, I suspect that it is just a case of demand for a billet version of the N54 block. It's not a platform that I'm personally very familiar with, but I suspect right now Billet maybe aren't getting the requests in a volume that would make it worth their while producing that block. Anyway, thanks heaps for your question there, and if you can get in touch with us with your sizing and shipping details, we'll fire off a fresh tee straight out to you. All right, that concludes our interview. And before we sign off, I just wanted to mention for anyone who's been perhaps hiding under a rock and hasn't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school and we specialize in teaching a range of performance automotive topics, everything from engine tuning and engine building through to wiring, car suspension and wheel alignment, data analysis, and race driver education. Now, remember, you've got that coupon code. You can use podcast75 at the checkout to get $75 off the purchase of your first course. You'll find our full course list at hpacademy.com/courses. Important to mention that when you purchase a course from us, that course is yours for life as well. It never expires. You can rewatch the course as many times as you like, whenever you like. The purchase of a course will also give you 3 months of access to our gold membership. That gives you access to our private members only forum, which is the perfect place to get answers to your specific questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly members webinars, which is where we touch on a particular topic in the performance automotive realm. We dive into that topic for about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. If the time zones don't work for you, that's fine too. You're going to get access as a gold member to our previous webinar archive. We've got close to 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. So remember that coupon code podcast75. Check out our course list at hpacademy.com/courses.